Wittgenstein famously wrote about games in a book called Philosophical Investigations, one of the most important works of 20th century philosophy, and one of my personal favourites. There's a passage in the Investigations that gets used a lot in game studies. In fact, I'd wager it's probably the most famous piece of philosophy in game studies. So, in that passage, he makes an argument that there is no one single thing, no single feature common to everything we call games that connects them all. They are rather connected by a network of similarities, big and small, which he called family resemblances. There is no single thing that you'll find in every single game. So we'll get into the significance of this and how he makes this point in detail in the next episode. But first, let's take a look at who Wittgenstein was and what his philosophy was all about. Today we're going to talk about what's probably the most famous case of a philosopher talking about games, Ludwig Wittgenstein. I thought it would be good to do a two-part episode about this, with the first part introducing you to Wittgenstein's life and philosophy, with the second part actually getting into what he says about games. So feel free to skip to that part if you're not interested in this one, but he really is one of the most interesting philosophers, I think. Certainly one of my personal favourites. Wittgenstein is a contender for being the most important and influential philosopher of the 20th century. Now, I know this is impossible to pinpoint exactly. Everyone will have different standards for judging this, and people can be influential in different ways, in different contexts. But by any standard, Wittgenstein is at least in the conversation. He had a huge impact on philosophical thought. His work is endlessly fascinating. He's one of philosophy's great writers, and whatever kind of philosophy you're into in whatever part of the world, Wittgenstein will come up for some reason at some point. Even people who don't like him and think he got everything wrong will begrudgingly acknowledge how influential he actually was. Wittgenstein was a radical thinker and quite a radical person. I think we could say that he was a certified weirdo, ferocious intellect, but an incredibly intense, intimidating, and in some ways quite a troubled person. No question he was a genius in my mind. He spent his whole philosophical career being preoccupied by language, what it is, how it works, what it does, how we should understand it, how we should use it, and how we should think about things like meaning and the role of language in human life and in philosophy. One common theme running throughout his work is that language is something so complicated and mysterious that it can bewitch us into having false impressions of things. Language can confuse us into thinking certain things are true or legitimate when they're not. Perhaps strangely for a philosopher, he thought philosophical problems themselves were a result of our being confused by language, that the reason we have philosophical problems in the first place is because we misunderstand how language works. If we did understand language correctly, the problems of philosophy would vanish. The three major texts he produced in thinking about all this are radical, bewildering, strange and profound in equal measure, and his views developed in complex and interesting ways as he got older and worked more, taught more, and wrote more. These texts were, along with the Investigations, an absolutely crazy book called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and a book compiled from some of the last collections of notes he made in his life called On Certainty. If you're even slightly curious, I'd recommend reading any of them. They're all, in their own ways, unlike anything else you'll ever read. Wittgenstein had a really interesting life, too. He was born in 1889 in Vienna, one of 9 siblings in one of the richest families in Europe. And that's not an exaggeration. The Wittgensteins were the second wealthiest family in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His family were heavily involved in Viennese culture and would often host the great cultural figures of the day, musicians and such like, for concerts and events at their home. Ludwig Wittgenstein inherited a fortune after his father's death in 1913, but didn't seem that keen to hang on to it, donating some to artists and later giving the rest to his sisters to look after. Tragically, 3 of his 5 brothers committed suicide. One, Rudy, asked a pianist in a Berlin bar to play a piece of music called Forsaken, Forsaken, Forsaken Am I, before mixing a drink of milk and cyanide for himself. Another brother, Kurt, shot himself in World War I when his troops refused to obey him and abandoned him. The third, Hans, died by presumed suicide after disappearing from a boat in America. The young Ludwig would react to this in writing at some point, saying, "I ought to have become a star in the sky, instead of which I've remained stuck on Earth." The Wittgensteins were of Jewish descent, which suddenly became very relevant information when World War II started and Hitler's Nazi army annexed Austria. But more on that later. Wittgenstein actually briefly went to school with Adolf Hitler, although there's no evidence that they met or spoke to each other. During his early university days, Wittgenstein studied engineering, first in Berlin and then in Manchester, particularly aeronautics and jet planes. He became particularly good at designing propellers, which naturally involved a lot of mathematics and logic. Apparently, he designed a propeller which would have small jet engines on the tips of its blades. The design was so good and so innovative that the necessary technology for using it didn't exist yet, and wouldn't for years. His work on this earned him a scholarship. Through his engineering studies, he became interested in the philosophy of mathematics and started kind of stalking the famous philosophers and logicians of the time. He met the logician Gottlob Frege in Jena and wanted to study with him, but Frege recommended he go to Cambridge, which he did, to meet Bertrand Russell, probably the most important philosopher in Britain at the time. Wittgenstein attended Russell's lectures, absolutely dominated the question sessions, and would follow Russell afterwards, bothering him at lunch, following him to his office, stuff like that, over and over. Russell was initially, understandably, rather exasperated by the man he came to refer to as his German friend in his private letters. Wittgenstein was Austrian. Russell soon came to realise, however, that this was not your average annoying student, and that he had a genuine genius on his hands. Russell later called Wittgenstein perhaps the most perfect example I have ever known of genius as traditionally conceived. Passionate, profound, intense, and dominating. Wittgenstein would later credit Russell with saving his life, because in the preceding years he was depressed, lonely, and often contemplated suicide, although it seemed like Wittgenstein often felt like this throughout his life. So Wittgenstein began studying at Cambridge, working on the philosophy of logic, maths, and language. He met the great economist John Maynard Keynes, who invited him to join an elite secret society called the Cambridge Apostles, which Wittgenstein joined, hated, and then very quickly left. But Wittgenstein participated quite actively in something called the Moral Sciences Club, which held weekly lectures and debates. Wittgenstein used to dominate the discussions so much that he eventually had to stop going because he just wouldn't let anybody else speak. Even before he stopped going, apparently it became custom that he would leave early to give other people a chance. It was during one of these meetings that a famous incident with Karl Popper occurred. Popper was one of the most important philosophers of science of the 20th century and was invited to give a talk. Wittgenstein ended up disagreeing with him quite heavily, at some point picking up a poker and kind of gesturing violently with it, and ended up storming out. There's been an entire book written just about this incident, Wittgenstein's Poker, the story of a 10-minute argument between two great philosophers. It's quite a good read. Another big name in philosophy at Cambridge at the time was G.E. Moore, who Wittgenstein also knew and interacted with. In 1914, Moore tried to get an early essay of Wittgenstein's accepted for a bachelor's degree, but Wittgenstein hadn't formatted it properly. Wittgenstein's measured response was the following: "If I'm not worth your making an exception for me, even in some stupid details, then I may as well go to hell directly. And if I am worth it and you don't do it, then, by God, you might go there." They didn't speak again for 15 years. Wittgenstein's studies were interrupted by World War I, when he undertook voluntary military service on the front line, for which he was decorated several times for acts of bravery and heroism. He was captured in 1918 and spent the closing 9 months of the war as a prisoner of the Italian army in prisoner of war camps at Como and Cassino. During and after the war, he worked on what would become the only book of philosophy he would publish in his lifetime, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which he completed after the war ended in 1918. Now, the Tractatus is, by any measure, a weird book. It's made up of 7 numbered statements and other numbered statements that follow from them and are connected to them. So it starts off with proposition 1, then proposition 1.1, which is a comment on proposition 1, then 1.11, which is a comment on 1.1, and the whole book is like that. This is what he says in the introduction. The book deals with the problems of philosophy and shows, I believe, that the reason why these problems are posed is that the logic of our language is misunderstood. The whole sense of the book might be summed up in the following words. What can be said at all can be said clearly, and what we cannot talk about, we must pass over in silence. Thus, the aim of the book is to draw a limit to thought. It will only be in language that the limit can be drawn, and what lies on the other side of the limit will simply be nonsense. The truth of the thoughts that are here communicated seems to me unassailable and definitive. I therefore believe myself to have found, on all essential points, the final solution of the problems. And if I am not mistaken in this belief, then the second thing in which the value of this work consists is that it shows how little is achieved when these problems are solved. After he wrote this book, Wittgenstein left Cambridge University and went to live and teach children in rural Austria, truly believing he'd solved all the problems of philosophy. There was no point in staying. He'd shown us how language works, how it reflects reality, and found the general form of the proposition, the logical form that every single possible linguistic proposition has. He'd shown us what is able to be said in language, drawn a limit to what language is able to express, to what makes sense and what doesn't, and therefore to what thought is able to do. The last sentence of the book stands alone, no comments necessary. What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. That's it. Philosophy was finished. Despite being part of one of the richest families in Europe, Wittgenstein refused to accept any money from his family, had given away his fortune, and lived the life of a hermit. A British philosopher and friend of his, Frank Ramsey, visited him on one occasion and said he was living in one tiny room with only a bed, a washstand, a small table and a chair in it, often eating only bread and butter and drinking cocoa. Any money, food, even Christmas presents his family sent to him, he sent back. He moved between various villages and schools, sometimes going under a false identity so no one would recognise him as a Wittgenstein. While he was away, the Tractatus was published and became a sensation in philosophy, propelling him to international academic fame. It probably wouldn't have been published without the help of Russell, who wrote an introduction to the book explaining its significance, but Wittgenstein thought Russell had misunderstood the book. Although, to be fair, Wittgenstein thought almost everyone had misunderstood him. He eventually returned to Vienna and stayed for a while. While he was there, Wittgenstein designed a house for one of his sisters. You can actually go and see it. It's in the middle of the city. It's now part of the Bulgarian embassy or something, but you can get a tour of it. He also started taking on certain academic engagements, attending conferences and discussions with scholars. Philosophers had been debating his book intensely, including a very influential group of philosophers and scientists known as the Vienna Circle, who invited Wittgenstein to take part in their meetings and discuss the Tractatus. Sometimes he would disagree with their readings of his work by turning his back to them and starting to read poetry out loud. Rudolf Carnap, one of the group's members, had this to say about Wittgenstein, which I think captures the feeling of reading some of his work. His point of view and his attitude towards people and problems, even theoretical problems, were much more similar to those of a creative artist than those of a scientist. One might say, similar to those of a religious prophet or seer. When finally, sometimes after a prolonged, arduous effort, his answers came forth, his statements stood before us like a newly created piece of art, or a divine revelation. The impression he made on us was as if insight came to him through divine inspiration, so that we could not help but feeling that any sober, rational comment or analysis of it would be a profanation. After attending a conference organised by a mathematician, Wittgenstein was impressed and reportedly said he was considering a return to philosophy. Every academic he knew that he was on good terms with fervently urged him to do so, and he eventually returned to Cambridge in 1929. The economist John Maynard Keynes wrote in a letter to his wife, "Well, God has arrived. I met him on the 5:15 train." Despite how famous he was and the roaring success of the Tractatus, Wittgenstein didn't have a PhD degree, and so couldn't teach at or be employed by Cambridge. But Russell noticed that there was a way around this, and encouraged Wittgenstein to submit the Tractatus as a PhD thesis. He did, and that same year defended it in front of a committee that included Russell and G.E. Moore. I must reiterate, these were two of the biggest names in British philosophy at the time. At the end of the defence, Wittgenstein clapped both of them on the shoulders and said, "Don't worry, I know you'll never understand it." It was, of course, accepted, and he was awarded a PhD. It went well beyond the requirements for one. Wittgenstein was made a Fellow of Trinity College and began teaching and writing philosophy again. The writings from this period would become the foundation of the philosophical investigations. But Wittgenstein's work would be interrupted in dramatic fashion in 1938, when Nazi Germany annexed Austria in an event known as the Anschluss, meaning connection or joining, literally the connection of Austria to Germany. This was the first act of territorial expansion by the Nazis and transformed Austria basically overnight, leading to outbursts of discrimination and violence against the Austrian Jewish community. This included a bunch of new discriminatory laws which classified people into different categories based on how Jewish they were, or how much of a Jewish descendants they had. People were classified as full Jews if they had 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents, and mixed blood if they had 2. Wittgenstein had 3. There thus began a mad scramble by the family to get their status downgraded from full Jew to mixed blood, which they had to apply to Hitler to do. There were 2,100 applications that year in 1939. Just a few days before the Nazis invaded Poland, Hitler granted 12 of these applications. The Wittgensteins was one of them. Their application was based on the fact that one of their grandparents was the illegitimate child of a German prince, and the fact that the Wittgenstein family had a lot of capital to negotiate with. The Nazis seized a good deal of it. Foreign currency, stocks, and 1,700 kilograms of gold. But the Wittgensteins were able to successfully negotiate their way out of trouble. The same year, G.E. Moore resigned the chair of philosophy at Cambridge, and Wittgenstein was elected in his place. Wittgenstein's actual teaching at Cambridge was unconventional for a philosophy professor, to say the least. One of the conclusions he came to when writing the investigations was that philosophy is nothing more than the result of linguistic confusions that occur when we misuse or misunderstand words and misunderstand how they work. Whereas in the Tractatus, he thought he'd solved all the problems of philosophy by doing philosophy and giving a once and for all philosophical answer to the philosophical problems. Now he began to doubt whether there were any genuine philosophical problems at all. In the investigations, Wittgenstein says that philosophical problems arise when language goes on holiday, when words are taken out of the places where they're ordinarily at home and placed somewhere where they're not at home. When we use words in our everyday lives, they have particular meanings and we get along fine. But philosophical problems only arise when we use words in a way that removes them from their everyday contexts where they make perfect sense. When philosophers use words like know or ask questions like what is knowledge and start analysing all the different things they might mean and trying to settle on the correct meaning, these words become mysterious and strange. But for Wittgenstein, there's no real mystery here. It's just that philosophers are using these words wrong and thinking there's some hidden truth behind them waiting to be discovered. But there's nothing hidden. Everything is open to view, and we just need to carefully remind ourselves of the uses and meanings that these words ordinarily have in our everyday lives. There, they are not mysterious, and their meaning is perfectly obvious. For the later Wittgenstein, there are no genuine philosophical problems, merely confusions brought on by philosophers using language mistakenly, and the role of philosophy should really be limited to sorting out these confusions. And Wittgenstein told his students as much, often encouraging them to give up studying philosophy and do something more meaningful with their lives, even becoming angry if they showed interest in becoming professional philosophers. And all of this in the middle of his lectures. Although, as a former student of Wittgenstein's, Norman Malcolm pointed out, it's hardly correct to speak of these meetings as lectures, although this is what Wittgenstein called them. For one thing, he was carrying on original research in these meetings. Often the meetings consisted mainly of dialogue. Sometimes, however, when he was trying to draw a thought out of himself, he would prohibit with a peremptory motion of the hand any questions or remarks. There were frequent and prolonged periods of silence, with only an occasional mutter from Wittgenstein and the stillest attention from the others. During these silences, Wittgenstein was extremely tense and active. His gaze was concentrated. His face was alive. His hands made arresting movements. His expression was stern. One knew that one was in the presence of extreme seriousness, absorption, and force of intellect. Wittgenstein was a frightening person at these classes. And to unwind after these classes, apparently Wittgenstein would rush directly to the cinema to watch mostly cowboy movies. Wittgenstein became rather unhappy as the Second World War went on, as he was still teaching at Cambridge and he seemed desperate to be doing something more meaningful which might even help with the war effort. With the help of a professor of medicine at Cambridge, around 1941 he took a job at Guy's Hospital in London, trying his best to conceal his identity as one of the world's most famous philosophers, although several of his colleagues knew who he was. He wrote in a journal at the time, "I no longer feel any hope for the future of my life. It's as though I had before me nothing more than a long stretch of living death. I cannot imagine any future for me other than a ghastly one, friendless and joyless." He also became more disdainful of the state of philosophy, being particularly annoyed by the types of articles published in Mind, to this day still one of the most prestigious philosophy journals in the world. And he also developed an intense dislike for Cambridge University in general. He said, "Everything about the place repels me. The stiffness, the artificiality, the self-satisfaction of the people. The university atmosphere nauseates me." He eventually resigned his professorship in 1947 to focus on writing, and spent a lot of time in this period of his life in Ireland, and went to stay with an ex-student of his who was now a professor in New York. During this time, he began the philosophical inquiry and writing that would later be published as On Certainty. But his health began to decline, and in 1949 he was diagnosed with inoperable prostate cancer. He travelled as much as he could, visited as many friends as he could, wrote as much philosophy as he could, but became less and less able. In 1951 he wrote a letter which said, "My mind's completely dead. This isn't a complaint, for I don't really suffer from it. I know that life must have an end once, and that mental life can cease before the rest does." A few months later he wrote again, "An extraordinary thing has happened to me. About a month ago, I suddenly found myself in the right frame of mind for doing philosophy. I had been absolutely certain that I'd never again be able to do it. It's the first time after more than 2 years that the curtain in my brain has gone up. Of course, so far I've only worked for about 5 weeks, and it all may be over by tomorrow, but it bucks me up a lot now." Wittgenstein died 13 days later in Cambridge, on the 29th of April 1951. The last thing he's known to have said is, "Tell them I've had a wonderful life." The Philosophical Investigations was published in 1953, 2 years after his death. A 1999 survey of American university and college teachers ranked it the most important book of the 20th century, highlighting the fact that it has a wide appeal across specializations, philosophical orientations, and traditions. In it, he introduced several concepts and arguments that are still often used and discussed, in philosophy and elsewhere. These include the language game, the idea that meaning is use, the private language argument, the discussion of rule following, the famous phrase form of life, and the concept of family resemblances. It's when he's introducing this last one in particular that he discusses games. And this is one of, if not the most famous case of a philosopher talking about games. We'll get into what he actually says about this in part 2. Thanks very much for listening. This has been Breaking the Game, and do stay tuned for the second part of this episode where we'll get more into Wittgenstein's philosophy and other videos where we get into lots of other things about philosophy and video games as well. Thanks.